Come see us on tour in Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, New York, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, San Jose, Buffalo, Toledo, Montreal, and Toronto. Go to jimmydore.com for the cheapest tickets.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. I'm Aaron Maté, sitting in for Jimmy Dore. We're going to turn to our top story, which is the ongoing crackdown on free speech when it comes to the issue of Palestine. So let's begin. Here is the footage of the latest arrest of a student in this country here on a foreign visa, simply for exercising their right to free speech and criticizing Israel and calling for an end to its mass murder campaign in Gaza. Her name is Rümeysa Öztürk. She is from Turkey. And last week in Massachusetts, this is what happened to her. So you can see there, some masked agents have stopped her in the middle of the street. This was during Ramadan. So she was coming on her way back from a Ramadan gathering.
Faces? You want to take those masks off? Is this a kidnapping? Yeah, you don't look like it. Why are you hiding your faces? Why are you hiding your faces? Can I see some faces here? How do I know this is the police? Seems like bullshit to me.
That's right. It was bullshit. This wasn't the police. This was ICE just carrying out a kidnapping of a foreign student simply because the Trump administration didn't like that she criticized Israel. In her case, she co-wrote an op-ed at her school, Tufts University, calling for the school to respect a vote for divestment from businesses dealing with Israel and criticizing Israel for carrying out mass murder in Gaza. And according to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, this is grounds for her removal from the United States. Here was Marco Rubio being asked about this.
A Turkish student in Boston was detained and handcuffed on the street by plainclothes agents. A year ago, she wrote an opinion piece about the Gaza war. Could you help us understand what the specific action she took led to her visa being revoked?
Yeah,
and what was your State Department's role in that process?
We revoked her visa. It's an F1 visa, I believe. We revoked it, and here's why. And I'll say it again. I said it everywhere. Let me be abundantly clear, okay? If you go apply for a visa right now, anywhere in the world, let me just send this message out. If you apply for a visa to enter the United States and be a student, and you tell us that the reason why you're coming to the United States is not just because you want to write op-eds, but because you want to participate in movements that are involved in doing things like vandalizing universities, harassing students, taking over buildings, creating a ruckus, we're not going to give you a visa. If you lie to us and get a visa and then enter the United States and with that visa participate in that sort of activity, we're going to take away your visa. And once you've lost your visa, you're no longer legally in the United States, and we have a right, like every country in the world has a right, to remove you from our country.
So there's Marco Rubio explaining why he thinks it's his prerogative within his purview to revoke the visa of a foreign student if he doesn't like what they say about Israel. Not even about the U.S., but about Israel. And again, in the case of this student, Rümeysa Öztürk, and as was the case with Mahmoud Khalil and others, there's no charge against them for any kind of anything, any crime, whether it's vandalism or terrorism. It's just Marco Rubio simply saying that their free speech goes against the interests of U.S. foreign policy, and therefore they can be deported. So to discuss all this, let's bring in our guest. Jenin Younes is a litigation counsel for the New Civil Liberties Alliance. At the NCLA, she's litigated against COVID-19 vaccine mandates and challenged the government in censorship of social media. And she also is of Palestinian background. Jenin, welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And just to be clear, I'm speaking in my personal capacity here. My organization hasn't taken a position on this issue, so these are my views, not necessarily NCLA's.
Okay, well, listen, before I ask you about your response to Marco Rubio, tell us a bit about your background because, I mean, yes, you are of Palestinian descent, but you also have a long record of fighting for free speech. So talk to us about, the cases that you've taken on just recently.
Yeah, so my father is Palestinian. I grew up entirely in the United States, but I have defended mainly what I would call conservative speech, especially people who dissented on issues related to COVID, including the new NIH director, Jay Bhattacharya, was one of my clients. He actually still is, but we've got to get him out of the lawsuit because you can't be a you can't be a plaintiff and defendant in the same lawsuit, but that's another story. So I, even though I'm not a conservative myself, I'm a big believer in free speech and the notion that the government cannot involve itself in censorship or the suppression of certain ideas that it finds inconvenient or antithetical to its policies. And it became clear to me during the Biden administration's during Biden's time in office that his administration was involved in influencing social media companies using various forms of using various types of influence, coercion, threats, pressure, and also cooperation, which I also contended was a First Amendment issue, in order to silence viewpoints it didn't like with respect to COVID, with respect to the 2020 election. And that's a First Amendment problem because the government cannot co-opt third parties, private companies, in order to do what it can't do directly. And since the government cannot suppress viewpoints it doesn't like, it also can't use third parties to do that. So we ended up going to the Supreme Court on that case, and I consider myself very principled on this issue. I'll defend conservative or liberal speech or any kind, really. But I consider what we're seeing now probably the most concerning escalation in censorship in modern history, maybe even before that.
Well, talk to us about that, especially given your background defending people in the MAGA movement from attacks on their free speech. How do you feel now to see, the head of the MAGA movement, the Trump administration, turning around and overseeing this crackdown on free speech simply because they don't like what foreign students are saying about Israel-Palestine?
Well, look, I'm used to people being hypocritical, so nothing surprises me all that much. I think it's absolutely almost hilarious that he has an executive order entitled "Restoring Free Speech and Ending Federal Censorship in America," while he's literally throwing people in ICE detention for writing op-eds that express the wrong views. I can't, and a lot of people I worked with on free speech issues during the COVID era are now defending this and saying, well, these people are guests in our country. They don't have any First Amendment rights. This isn't even a constitutional issue. Their right to be in this country is completely contingent on whatever the president decides, and so they can be kicked out for any or no reason. This is completely incorrect reading of the law. It's an incorrect reading of immigration law. It's more importantly an incorrect reading of constitutional law, and it's also very unprincipled because true believers in free speech don't, when the moment someone says something they don't like, they don't find reasons to try to circumvent free speech free speech principles and say, well, you know what, actually there's this little out because they're not a citizen, so actually we can kick them out for their speech.
Well, talk to us about that, because this is the argument that we're not talking about citizens, we're talking about guests in our country. So why should they have the same protections as citizens do when it comes to free speech, especially if they don't plan on living here and they plan on going back to their home country? So why give them the full protections of free speech?
Well, there are legal reasons and then there are philosophical reasons. I'll start with the legal. The First Amendment is a constraint on government. It doesn't differentiate depending on the citizenship status of the speaker. It reads, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. To the extent Congress enacts a statute that is penalizing people for their speech, including removal from this country, it is unconstitutional. Statute, obviously, that conflicts with the Constitution falls because the Constitution is superior to any statute. So to the extent that Secretary Rubio is claiming that people may be thrown out of the country, whether they're on green cards or visas for their speech, if the statute may be read that way, it is unconstitutional. Another option courts have is to recognize that Congress probably didn't. In fact, I would say that the legislative history shows that Congress did not intend to allow people to be kicked out of the country based on their speech. And so read the statute consistent with the Constitution and the legislative history and say, no, this is not an acceptable reading of this statute. And so the statute that they're utilizing says that it allows the Secretary of State to remove people from the country if he deems them a threat to our foreign policy, that their presence in the United States will have adverse foreign policy consequences, and to sort of do so unilaterally. It's a very obscure provision and has not been invoked very much. There is only one court decision on it, which incidentally was written by Trump's sister. She was a district court judge in New Jersey, and she said that that provision was unconstitutionally vague, that it didn't give adequate notice to people about what it intended to punish. And to the extent it punished speech, it appeared to conflict with the First Amendment. Now, I was criticized on social media for not acknowledging that that decision was reversed by the Third Circuit, which is the appellate court. However, it was reversed on completely unrelated grounds, on jurisdictional grounds. The appellate court did not address this issue. So to her reasoning still is valid reasoning. It's obviously not binding on any court other than in that jurisdiction, but it's persuasive reasoning. I find her reasoning very persuasive. So in any event, to sort of boil it down, the First Amendment is a protection for people in this country. It's not, it doesn't matter what the citizenship status of the speaker is. And then you also have philosophical, arguments, which I think are very strong here. The purpose of the First Amendment, the reason the framers included it in the Bill of Rights was that we understand that government should not be in charge of deciding what's true and what's false. There are not these, all-knowing people in government who get to decide what the truth is and punish people accordingly. The best way to reach good ideas is to debate and discuss them, not to censor people. And so those ideas all hold true whether or not someone is a citizen or not. So I find these arguments really hypocritical and cynical, frankly. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people just don't want brown people in the country who disagree with them.
Well, as we've discussed, you've defended conservatives from attacks on their free speech rights. And for Trump, this was a major selling point in his campaign, that he was going to restore free speech after so many assaults on it led by Democrats. And let's go back to 2022 when Marco Rubio, who's now presiding over this crackdown on students who are critical of Israel, when he made a campaign against censorship a centerpiece of a speech that he gave at CPAC, the annual major conservative gathering. This is some of what Marco Rubio said.
We have witnessed things that we had never seen in this country before. For the first time now, we started to see the building momentum behind, first of all, there's now a speech code, right? Every single person in this room and the overwhelming majority of people that you know are one word away. It didn't matter if you're 13 years old when you said it. You're one word, you're one statement, you're one retweet, you're one like away from destroying your life. There are kids in America that have had their admissions to a college revoked because of something they said or did or liked on social media when they were 14. But it goes beyond that.
It does go beyond that. Now there are kids in college who right now are having their admission revoked because they criticize Israel, and Marco Rubio is presiding over it.
That's absolutely true. And part of the way they're trying to get away with this is by saying it's not about speech, it's about behavior. But all of the people that they have put in detention have only engaged in speech. And also there are a few people who are not citizens who've been expelled. And that's through a different kind of coercion where the administration is withdrawing funding from universities, federal funding from universities, if they don't crack down on so-called anti-Semitic speech, which presumably most people understand at this point is actually just pro-Palestine speech. So these are several different ways they're getting at, they're trying to silence pro-Palestine speech and doing so pretty successfully. So they're conflating some behavioral issues that probably did take place at Columbia and other universities, although I think it was actually more from the pro-Israel side than the pro-Palestine side, but never mind that. Because the people in detention, Mahmoud Khalil, Ozturk, Ms. Chung, Yoon Seo Chung, who is not in detention, but the administration has been trying to deport her, and thankfully a judge issued a temporary restraining order saying that they couldn't. All of these people only engaged in political speech. And, there's this attempt to sort of conflate the possible actions of other people with what they've done and say, well, these protests were violent, these people took over, they made encampments, they took over Hamilton Hall. Well, that's the way that criminal law works, and frankly, classical liberal principles in general work, is that you don't punish people for the behavior of others, and protests are, massive. You you can't hold one person responsible for the behavior of thousands of other people at these protests. And I'll point to the fact that conservatives made exactly this argument about January 6th. And about some of the trucker protests in Canada that actually did get kind of sometimes violent. And they, rightfully made the point that people who were peacefully protesting on January 6th or people who were peacefully protesting the vaccine mandates in Canada were not responsible for the unruly or unlawful behavior of other people. And so there's this conflation of these notions, and that's part of what they're doing here. I mean, you notice it in Rubio, the way Rubio uses his language. He says, well, it's not, we thought she was, if you say that you're coming into the country to study and then you participate in violent protests, and well, there's Ozturk, there's no evidence that she participated in any protests. And in any event, she has a right to participate in protests. There's nothing unlawful about that. And she's not responsible for the behavior of other people who may have done unlawful or unruly things.
And there are very few people, and you're one of them, who can claim to be consistent on all these issues, who criticized the crackdown on free speech when it was done by Democrats, the excessive sentencing that was handed down to people who were there on January 6th but didn't take part in any violence or destruction, and who now can criticize the Trump administration's crackdown on free speech. It's for some reason, it's very hard to find consistency across the political spectrum.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of people. And I'll say Glenn Green, no one says it better than Glenn Greenwald. I mean, nobody thinks that their own speech should be censored and their own ideas should be censored. There isn't anybody. So lots of people claim to believe in free speech when it's their speech that's under attack. But then the minute that's ideas they don't like that's under attack, they're the first to embrace it. And what they do is they use these other, this is hate speech. Oh, this speech is killing people. This is dangerous. Nobody says, oh, we embrace censorship. We just don't like ideas that are different than ours. So they come up with ways to try to justify it that sound like something other than censorship, but it's censorship.
One more legal question, and then we'll take a break. An immigration court is much different than a criminal court or a civil court. So do you think these students have an uphill battle here because the same protections that they might get if they were being charged with something in a criminal court might not apply inside the immigration system?
So I'm not an immigration law expert. I'll say that as a caveat. I believe that what most of them are doing is they're filing petitions in federal court, not immigration court, based on their First Amendment rights. So they're sort of proactively saying that their First Amendment rights are being violated by these immigration proceedings. So as far as I understand it, these will mostly be, the First Amendment decisions will take place in regular federal court, not immigration court. To the extent that they may sort of end up juxtaposing with immigration issues, I would hope that immigration judges understand the First Amendment principle. It's actually really pretty simple. The First Amendment, again, it's a restraint on government. It's not about the speaker. To the extent a statute restricts speech, it is unconstitutional. So hopefully, even if these are decided in immigration court, it'll come out positively. But I'm nervous because judges aren't always the best.
Come see us on tour in Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, New York, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, San Jose, Buffalo, Toledo, Montreal, and Toronto. Go to jimmydore.com for the cheapest tickets.